So I had an article suggested to me today regarding a paper that was titled Meaning from Movement and Stillness, Signatures of Coordination Dynamics Reveal Infant Agency by somebody named Eliza Sloan. Now this paper seemed to make a more focused claim about agency and the evolution of agency in individuals, but the article made the claim that it gave some insight into the genesis of conscious awareness. Regardless, I would like to speak about this because this is something I've thought about for a long time, and I thought, well, I might have something to contribute in this conversation. So first off, when we talk about conscious awareness, what is conscious awareness? Well, there's an explanatory priority problem here, because awareness comes prior to consciousness. Consciousness is the act of awareness, being aware of objects within itself. So once objects arise in awareness, we say we're conscious. So when you go to sleep and you have dreamless sleep, deep dreamless sleep, you might say that you're unconscious, but I would not say that you are unaware. I would say that you are just aware of the absence of content, right? And you've associated the arising of content and objects with your presence, but it's not. It's the presence of consciousness. So consciousness is the arising of objects in awareness. Well, where did the objects come from? Well, there's two prime objects that arise in awareness. The first is I. That's the concept, the self-referential concept of I, right? I know that I exist in the mind, right? And then there is the concept of, well, the object of amness, right? The fact that I exist in space, right, means I am. So we have these two prime objects, I-ness in the mind and amness in the world. And these are the expressions of awareness in both of these domains. Now they're undifferentiated to begin with. So as a body grows and as a mind and body develops, there's no distinction made between the mind and the body and the entirety of the mental landscape or the entirety of the environment the body is in, right? There's just amness, and there's no sense that my body is different from the rest of the environment. And this I-ness, right, also exists, and there's no sense that this I-ness is separate from any other conceptual object. Now, I don't know if this happens during gestation or after birth, but regardless, at some point, that child will learn that it is separate from other objects. And for the sake of explanation, let's just say that it learns it's separate from its mother. So at some point, the mother sets the child down, and the child becomes aware that there is an object boundary between it and its mother, that this I amness does not extend to the mother, right? The mother is a separate object. And so now, arising in the mind simultaneously is also the sense of I-ness and not I, right? And so we end up with a dualistic dyad that bifurcates the world for the child physically between itself and its environment and the mother, which is now separate. And the self-concept of I and the awareness that there are things that are not I, this concept, not I. Now, these bifurcations will continue and these dualistic dyads will continue. The child will learn that there are other objects apart from just this simple distinction of I am and I am not. There will also arise this and that, right? And so too will arise new categories of not I in the mind. And this will give rise to the breadth of objects that we experience, both mentally, conceptual objects, and physically in the world. These distinctions will be made, and these things will become discrete and individual. So we will parse the world into objects, and we will parse the mental landscape into concepts. And we can do this in different ways. We can do this first from observing an object and then modifying a concept. Right? I would say this is an influent process. I'm not saying that the mind is in, but for the sake of articulating this, I would say this is an influent process. We're starting from the world or from a concept, but we're always terminating on another concept. We're modifying another concept. And then there are effluent processes, right, that extend out into the world and modify an object within space. So all of these objects and their boundaries draw the distinctions that characterize physical objects in all the ways that they're characterized. All the dimensions in which a thing can be explained and described that make it discrete all arise through this object boundary function. Now, we also have set functions and grouping functions. So we have objects in the world, and we have concepts in the mind, and some of the objects in the world and concepts in the mind are made up of other concepts or objects. So for instance, right now, the chair that I'm sitting on is a rolling chair. And it's made up of a whole bunch of constituent components. It has wheels, it has a post, it has a back, it has a seat, it has armrests, it has a nylon backing on it. All of these things are themselves individual objects. But together, organized and coordinated in the way that they are, they're grouped as a set under the compound object chair. They're recognized as one object, even though it's comprised of many other objects, right? This gestalt that arises is associated with the concept chair. So I can have a concept chair that is associated with a singular object chair. It can also be associated with the set of objects that make up a chair. And it can also be associated with all the different types of chairs that still fall under this concept, right? And likewise, I have the object chair. And in the mind, I will have the concept chair. I'll have the set of concepts associated with chairs. So, for instance, what kind of chair do I like? When do I need a chair? Where am I likely to find a chair? All of those associated concepts will also be part of the constituent set of concepts that make up the broader concept chair. So we have sets both in the world and in the mind, comprised of objects both in the world and in the mind, that anchor across this phenomenological boundary that divides the conceptual and the physical. So, all of that said, now we also have this sense of agency. Well, what is agency? Do we really need an agent, a conscious agent, in the sense that people actually think about it as? Well, I would say no, and I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm not going to drag on about why, and maybe I will in another video, in terms of free will and the implications of all of that and whatnot. But just looking at the processes we've already outlined, we can experience the body as the prime object. And we can, because eventually that amness is resolved to the body, right? We divide the world, divide the world, divide the world until we're left with this one continuous thing, or most continuous thing, because it's not continuous. You go to sleep and forget about your body. But the most continuous thing in your experience is your body, and so that becomes your sense of amness. It gets localized. So this body can get hungry, right? And that creates a state, a sensation within the body. And that object, that's a new object, that's a different object than its satiated state, right? Will be connected to the concept of hunger. And the concept of hunger will be associated with a whole bunch of other concepts, right? The things I like to eat, the things I don't like to eat, whatever. And the fact that eating itself will satiate hunger. And then, through an effluent process, so I've had an influent process moving from the body to the concept of hunger. Now an effluent process will go out into the world, back to the body, and prompt my action to go get food, masticate it, consume it, and satisfy my hunger, right? So what is it when we have actions in the world? What do those look like, right? Because they're object boundary interactions, right? My body has to interact with other objects in the world. So what does that look like psychologically? Well, these are operators, right? So in the world, this looks like action. And an operator can be thought of as a third object that modifies two other objects, but is a temporal object. It exists only during the operation and then no longer exists. So I can say that there's an operator, which is the act of getting up and getting the food. There's the operator of eating the food and all that goes along with it. And then there's operators also in the mind that extend just to concepts and are for the sake of modifying two concepts in the mind. So if I take the concept of three, which is born of object sets of three objects that I've now abstracted out to the concept three to represent all of the sets of three things that I've experienced in my life, and I take the concept four, which likewise arose through all of the object sets that are comprised of four objects that I have abstracted out into the concept of four, right? I can interact my concept of three and four apart from the objects, abstracted from the objects, and I can modify just those concepts. And so I can add them, right? And I can get the concept 7. I can multiply them and get the concept of 12, right? But this concept of multiplication or addition is just a certain type of object boundary interaction that I'm applying. And the multiplication itself, the process, the function of it, exists only temporally until the operation is resolved and the new concept takes form. I've modified either one or both concepts, right? That's what operators do. They take two objects, whether conceptual or physical, and it modifies them, either one or the other or both. So I can take a soft object and I can take a hard object and I can use the kinetic operator, right, of striking them together, and I can crush the smaller object, modifying it. So anyway, we are constantly modifying objects and we are constantly modifying concepts. These things are going back and forth across the phenomenological boundary that divides the physical space and the mental space. And it is this interaction across this boundary which produces conscious experience, which awareness is aware of. These states in the body will give rise to preference, concepts of like and dislike, which will give rise to our emotional sense, and our recognition of the emotional sense in other objects and the way that they interact can be abstracted out so that we can act on others emotionally. All these things are just concepts and objects and elaborations of these concepts and objects and their interactions, their sets, their decompositions, and the patterns that those sets tend to take. So, lastly, because this is just too much information to get into a single video, we'll quickly just discuss patterns, because as we look at objects, and we look at objects that function correctly in the world, they produce reliable patterns, right? So when I talked about the concept of chair, right, there are certain organizational principles that are necessary to make a proper chair, right? And those tend to be pretty continuous and consistent across all chairs. Well, likewise, when we have concepts that function correctly right? Like all of math, for instance. When I talked about the concepts of 3 and 4 and interacting them together, right? That's a pattern that I can abstract out. I can use that pattern with any set of concepts that will fit and satisfy that pattern, and I can apply it over and over again, right? Well, these durable patterns that our set function, our grouping function, recognizes, they give rise to our sense of intuition. So once I've seen a pattern work a whole bunch of times in this place or that place with these concepts or those concepts or whatever, then when I recognize a partially constructed pattern, or I start to see that pattern emerge through an object set interaction, then I can infer the rest of that pattern, and I can fill in the blanks, even though it might be content that I haven't ever experienced before. It might be new content, new objects, but the fact that they're organizing themselves in a recognizable way that seems to conform with a previous pattern that I've abstracted and developed allows me to infer the other parts of the pattern that are missing. And I can infer the concepts necessary through the object boundaries interactions that are missing to complete the pattern. And so I can make leaps to new concepts that didn't exist to me and that I haven't experienced before through the application of patterns that I do know of, abstracted from complete sets of those patterns and applied to partial constructions of that pattern in a new abstracted set. So that's how our intuition works. We might see a set of object interactions in the physical world, and we might be able to predict what will come next, or what object is missing, or what behavior will arise out of an individual based on a reliable pattern that we've already seen in a whole bunch of other circumstances that we've abstracted out. And with our group function, we've been allowed to generalize to other sets and conditions. So anyway, I feel like I have said a lot, and it's a lot of information. It's difficult to convey all of this in a short amount of time. But the point being, consciousness arises first as the experience of I am within awareness. That I amness then becomes differentiated through a series of divisions, bifurcations, into dualistic dyads, which are then elaborated out to give us the landscape of objects and patterns and sets and preferences and actions that we have. So, if that was helpful, I guess give me a thumbs up. I don't know. And if you think that you have a better explanation, or you think I've gotten something mixed up here, let me know. Just put it in the comments, or make a response. So anyway, have a good day. I hope that was helpful.